So welcome to the Blitzscaling Startup Podcast. We're joined today by Dan Greco. Dan, you're an associate professor and with tenure, I think, at Yale University in philosophy. You've won the Karl Popper Prize and the Young Epistemologist Prize, which sounds really cool to me, but I don't know if anyone else is impressed. And you are the proud author of your first book, Idealization in Epistemology. So welcome to Blitzscaling a Startup.
Hi.
So if folks are in, New Orleans next month, they can go and see you at the American Philosophical Association meeting there. And of course, they can get your book, Idealization in Epistemology. I don't think it's available on Amazon, but they can just Google it and find it.
It is available on Amazon. If you have institutional access to Oxford Scholarship Online, that's much better. You don't have to pay for it. They price these things to sell to libraries. So try to read it, but try not to pay for it.
Yeah, because it's like $80.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it is available on Amazon. All right, I was looking for it, but I didn't. I kind of assumed it was on Amazon. So, where else can people find you?
If you just Google my name, I've got a website. I see that I haven't really updated it. I think the CV listed on it is updated.
It better be. That's where I found all my information about you.
Yeah, let me. Have I? If you Google my name, you'll find a website. It will have slightly out-of-date information. The CV on it will have slightly more up-to-date information.
Very cool. And so obviously, you're a philosopher, not an entrepreneur or a business person. And both Reed and I studied philosophy. So we love philosophy. We've had another philosophy prof from Harvard, Sean Kelly, on the podcast a few months ago, and we're really excited to have you here. But before we get into who you are, your background, what I want to do is just lay out clearly what is epistemology and how it relates to startups. And maybe the right starting point is Dan, what is epistemology? How do you define it?
Yeah, so etymologically, it comes from Greek, where basically just means the study of knowledge. It's a little bit fussy how to translate epistema, but usually people do knowledge. You might think, how can you study knowledge in general, right? You can study particular domains of knowledge, like biology. I'm interested in what we know about life. Chemistry, what we know about, how substances undergo chemical reactions. Not a great definition because it's circular, but it's harder to give a good definition of chemistry. So epistemology, studying knowledge in general. Well, we can ask general questions about learning, about evidence, about what it takes for evidence to support a hypothesis. And I tend to think there isn't a really fine, there isn't a really sharp distinction between epistemology and philosophy of science, because questions about, the last one I mentioned, what it takes for evidence to support a hypothesis. You could think of that as, well, what does it take to know something? When you have good enough evidence. But you could also think of that as, when is a scientific theory well supported? I think there are questions on the border there. There are also questions on the border between epistemology and psychology, right? If psychologists study how we in fact reason, you can think of epistemology as the sort of normative analog of that. So psychologists study how we reason, maybe epistemologists study how we should reason, but you can't really ask questions about the shoulds while being totally indifferent to the how we actually do it. You might think you need to have some sense of how we reason to know what opportunities there are for making marginal improvements.
And for entrepreneurs, I think the question of how do you know anything, which is really the the core question of epistemology is, tremendously important. I think Reed says when he evaluates startup founders who have started their, on their second or third company, the thing he looks for most is whether they've improved in their decision-making process, their capacity to make, good informed decisions. And, that's really, decision-making is really about figuring out what you can know. So maybe this is, the most important skill for entrepreneurs. So that's kind of what I'm arguing.
I mean, I certainly, when it comes to decision making, I like taking, it's called the decision theoretic approach, where you have this, I think, nice, tidy, idealized model of decision making, where what you do depends on what options are open to you, what your opinions are, where that gets represented with probability distribution over ways the world might be, and then what your values are, where that gets represented by a utility function. And so I like to think of the sort of informal questions about epistemology as bearing on what probabilities ought to factor into decision theoretic models, or at least when you want to formalize the informal questions of epistemology, you can understand questions that you're asking about evidence, explanation, when is a hypothesis well supported. You can kind of translate that into probabilistic terms when you want to think, okay, should I expand or not? Some business decision I'm thinking, should I try to expand into a new market? Maybe it's not always fruitful to address that by trying to do it explicitly decision theoretically, but to the extent that you do, you're confronted with epistemological questions about, okay, what do I know in the first place? That maybe means what possibilities can I just rule out versus what's compatible with my knowledge? Those are the possibilities that I need to leave open. And then also questions about, how likely various possibilities are, or how likely something is conditional on my doing this or that. I'd see that all as sort of applied epistemology.
So before we jump into, your background, I'm going to do a quick shout out. So for folks who are listening to this, please, remember to like and subscribe so you can get more, live streams from us and more content from us. If you're listening to this on the podcast stream, which, most people are, this is on our main Blitzscaling and Startup stream, and we have a separate podcast called Blitzscaling Interviews. So Dan, you're part of our main podcast because you're a philosopher. That's usually just Chris and I, but I bring in philosophers in our main podcast. We have a separate stream with interviews, or separate podcasts with interviews that folks can check out. And then we're also on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. So, Dan, you're about my age. That means you grew up, in the late 90s, in the 90s and the early noughts. And where did you grow up?
New York City. That's where I'm born and raised.
Born and raised in New York. Okay, I couldn't find that online. So you grew up in New York City, and you went to Princeton, I guess, to do your bachelor's. What were you like in high school that got you to go to Princeton to begin with, and to go to Princeton in philosophy?
Well, first I didn't expect to major in philosophy when I started. I expected to major in economics.
Okay.
And I took a lot of economics. I liked it. I still like it a lot. But philosophy wasn't really on my radar. And it was really just, I took some classes first year. Had a class, it was actually a political science class, but the TA was a philosophy TA. And I really liked the way that he asked us to write papers. I think I had, maybe in high school or in other classes, paper writing always felt sort of more disorganized, or you're trying to fill up the words, but I feel like in my philosophy classes, I felt like it was just a much more sort of orderly and clear, to me at least, way of thinking, right? Where you don't have to avoid the first person. You can explicitly say, "Here's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to try and convince you that this objection fails." And then just be really sort of pedantic and explicit about how that works. I did debate in college, which I think may have been scratching a similar itch to philosophy. So yeah, it's really, I took some philosophy classes and found that I really liked it, and kind of never looked back.
And you write very, very well. I was reading some of your papers, and extremely clearly written, which is rare in general in life, but especially amongst academics. When did you learn to do that? Like, did you learn? Is that something that comes naturally to you? Is that something you kind of develop?
This is how to philosophers, especially people that are called analytic philosophers, are sometimes accused of having a kind of fetish for for clarity. People who don't like the style of writing will say that it's not really clear, or it's but yeah, I'll say it's the kind of so okay, what am I talking about when I say a fetish? When I'm giving students advice for how to write papers, actually, this is just something I learned from one of my undergrad instructors that I just steal. I credit him because I send them to his document. They say, if your writing sounds like it's aimed at a third grade audience, you've probably pitched things about right. Like, you want to be writing to a smart third grader. And why is that? I think the more sort of dense and difficult the topic, the easier it is to just lose people. And so sometimes people write as if they're trying to convince their reader or convince their audience that they must be really clever. They're trying to make sure that the reader doesn't feel like they've identified any knockdown objections, because they're not totally sure what's going on. Whereas I prefer the kind of writing that makes its vulnerabilities bare by really just trying to bring the reader along as clear, so that they know exactly what's being said. They can follow each step of the argument. If there's some place they're going to get off, if there's a weak point where they're going to object, they know exactly what the possible places to object are. I think of it as the sort of so you think of the Karl Popper's idea that scientific theories should be falsifiable, right? So they should be open to evidence or experiments that would refute them. I don't think that's exactly right, but I like the spirit of that idea, and I think the analog of that in analytical writing is maybe you're not making an empirical claim, so it's not that there's some evidence that could falsify you, but we should still know what kinds of objections your view is open to, or what assumptions it's making, where if that assumption fails, then the view doesn't work. And so I think writing in such a way that makes it clear what your vulnerabilities are, like, that's the kind of clarity that I think has the same thing going for it that in the empirical sciences falsifiability does.
It's interesting when you do, as an entrepreneur, when you pitch investors, at least, but it's also true about like how you should think of your business yourself. The thing, like the kind of like masterful move, is to highlight all the reasons why you might be wrong, or why your business might fail, and discuss them and have like an explicit understanding of why you might be successful, why you might fail, and enable a third party to engage with that, with the same information that you have. So that kind of jumped into my mind when you were thinking. So you did your BA at Princeton, or AB. I'm not sure what the difference is.
Thing. Yeah.
All right. And your master's in philosophy at Cambridge, and you went back to MIT. what, like, how does that work? Like, why would somebody choose to go, like, these are all like super prestigious universities, obviously. Like, why would somebody choose, or why did you choose to go to all these like different universities instead of, pursue, or like staying at Princeton or staying at Cambridge or et cetera?
I mean, in general, I think it's I had a wonderful undergrad experience at Princeton. I really liked my professors there. But I think across the board, it's good. I think if you're going to stay in academia, but probably not just if you're going to stay in academia, just to get exposed to different perspectives. And I actually feel like Cambridge was more of that than the difference between Princeton and Cambridge. I think was bigger than the difference between Princeton and MIT.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there are boring personal reasons why I went to Cambridge. It was like I'd been thinking about doing study abroad just because I thought it would be a fun experience. And then my, then girlfriend, now wife, had kind of like knowing that I might be trying to get to Europe. She was like going to be in Paris for 2 years. So then I was like, oh, wow, I really have to do this. But no, I think it was good for me. So they're just like all sorts of differences in who's or what ideas like seem like the natural ones that, if you're going to argue for something, you've got to contrast it with this. Like Wittgenstein was just a much bigger deal there. Michael Dummett, who probably feel like listeners will probably have heard of Wittgenstein. They probably won't have heard of Michael Dummett, but he looked pretty large there. Even like earlier stuff in the history of philosophy, like Berkeley and idealism. Like I don't think I was exposed to that as an undergrad, and that it seemed like ideas that people liked at Cambridge, were sort of continuous with earlier traditions in the history of philosophy that I'd heard of, but just maybe hadn't really spent any time with because I wasn't around people who took them really seriously. So yeah, I think that was probably a good experience just for the sake of, if you spend all your time in one intellectual community, it's like the fish who doesn't know that they're wet, right? You don't know what assumptions you're making are kind of idiosyncratic. And so even if you end up liking those assumptions and you want to defend them, you should know that they're idiosyncratic to know that, when you're talking to somebody who's from a different background, that, you're going to need to present things differently if you're going to be persuasive to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm in Bangkok right now. I think cool. I let you know. Did I tell you that?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I'm in Bangkok. So originally I flew to Bangkok from the US, and I kind of arrived, and I felt like the things that stood out to me about Bangkok were essentially just like how Asian people are. So like they were like really in tune with like your emotions. So say like you like imply something, they'll like really read a lot into it. Like that's what stood out to me about the place. And then so we're here for a month, and we went to visit my wife's family. That's why we're in Asia, in Taiwan, which is where they live now. And then we came back to Bangkok because I couldn't stay in Taiwan. So I'm back in Bangkok, and I've been here for almost a week now. And the things that stood out to me about Bangkok were totally different. Because I was kind of like coming from a totally different context. And actually,
Bangkok contrasted what's distinctive about Bangkok as contrasted with Taiwan, very distinctive.
Right.
Distinctive about Bangkok contrasted with
New York. Yeah. So it's kind of like coming from New York to Bangkok, it's kind of like the Asianness that stood out to me. And then coming from Taiwan, it's interesting. It's actually like the New Yorkness of Bangkok that stood out to me.
Huh. Oh, cool. I've never been to either one. So.
Yeah, Bangkok's an interesting city. Like it's by far the most similar city to New York I've ever been to.
How big is it?
Bigger than New York. It's a very, very big city. It's it's kind of like a combination of an Asian city in New York. And yeah, like people, it's funny, like you meet like typical New York characters, right? Where it's like you go to the restaurant and there's like a guy who's working at the restaurant, just like pretty much just like tunes out the entire world. And he's kind of like there going through the motions and kind of like totally tuned out everything because there's just like too much input to deal with it. It's like the waiter who's like kind of grumpy and tuned out everything. Like those people don't exist in that many places, but they do exist here.
Huh. Yeah, I feel like I don't have enough of a sense of what's distinctive about New York for me to be able to go to. Well, I sort of doubt that if I like spent a bunch of time in some place like Bangkok, but or Tokyo, like would it one of them stand out to me as more New Yorkish than another one? It just, even though I've lived in New York for a long time, I don't know. I suspect I don't have that like general category.
Yeah. For me, so I lived in New York for almost 10 years, and the most New York story, the thing that kind of like was the most New York kind of experience I had was at some point I was like in the subway, and I'd lived there for 5 years, I think, by then. And there were this family of tourists from, I don't know where, like presumably Middle America somewhere. And they wanted to sit, and I was kind of like taking up 2 seats where like my bag was on a seat or whatever. But the train was like mostly empty. And they expected me to kind of like notice that they wanted to sit down and to kind of like accommodate them. And because I was like so in my like New York mode, I just like totally tuned out everything, right? I'm just like staring out into the blank, and right, and into the void. And they got like super offended that I didn't pay attention to them. And it like highlighted to me how kind of New Yorkified I'd become at that point. You're kind of like, it's an amazing place, like New York, you're like walking and then there's like some guy dressed up as some animal with a boom box on a bicycle, and you just walk by and you don't even pay attention.
Yeah, maybe just too accustomed to it or too adapted to it, because I feel like I would do that here too.
Yeah. Well, you're too much of a New Yorker. I always like help. My wife always bothers me about this. I'm Canadian, right? So I have to be like, I just like can't help myself. I have to be nice to people. It's despite like I'm not a nice person at all, but I just like have to act it out. So there's like at some point I was walking through Penn Station, and there's some homeless guy in a wheelchair, and his shoe fell off, and he was trying to like get his shoe, and he was like trying to get someone to help him get his shoe, and like like hundreds of people passed by, like no one even looked at him.
Yeah.
And I stopped off and I like put his shoe back on his foot. But that's like the least New York attitude.
I'd like to think I would help in that circumstance. I remember as a kid once, this was back when coins were in use and weren't totally of negligible value. I remember I saw a homeless person using a cup to ask for coins, and I gave him a few quarters, and then I found there was coffee in that cup. He wasn't homeless, and I was mortified. And maybe that really reinforced my just mind your business lesson that I've learned.
So, okay, so now, you worked at NYU, and I'm actually quite interested about that, as I noticed a lot of Ivy League philosophy profs started at NYU before going to work for an Ivy League university. Like, is there a reason for that, or?
Yeah. So, and we have these rankings philosophy as a discipline, I think, is more into rankings than most other, at least humanistic disciplines, for better or worse. And NYU has long been at the top of the philosophy rankings. And in general, the rankings don't. I mean, it's just a reputational survey, right? You certainly takes a lot to run it, but you basically just ask a bunch. You make some decision about who the people whose opinion you initially respect is, and then ask them to rank departments where you just give them a list of faculty. So you're not asked. It's not like U.S. News and World Reports where they have some complicated way of weighting lots of different factors. It's just, here's the faculty at this program. How impressive do you think that is on a scale of 1 to 5? And I think it's because of those rankings that places like NYU, Rutgers is another one where, they were able to kind of make the case to their administrations. A philosophy department said, look, if you give us a bunch of money, we can. It doesn't have to be that much money, right? We're not building labs or anything. No particle accelerators, right? Just money for salaries, right? They don't even need lots of postdocs or anything. So give us a bunch of money in the sense of a bunch for a humanities department, but not in the sense of a lot for a university. Then we can recruit a bunch of people from other programs and rise in these rankings, and so you'll have something to show for it. And so NYU did that. Rutgers did that. Pittsburgh did that. NYU, Rutgers, and Pittsburgh are maybe Pittsburgh is third or fourth. Maybe they fluctuate a bit. It's not, right. But they're all much better philosophy departments than you might predict just on the basis of the overall standing of the university.
Interesting.
And it's been a wonderful thing for philosophy as a whole because of just the way that academic salaries. It's not entirely a market process, but like when NYU, I think, is largely responsible for raising salaries of philosophers across the board just by having kind of bid up the sort of equilibrium price. And there were a few things like that. I suspect it was only possible because we had these rankings in the first place. So I've been in like meetings about compensation across different departments, and I now I know that some people in humanities departments outside of philosophy think it's like kind of weird that why do philosophers get paid more than religious studies scholars? In some universities they're lumped together, but that's how these things work.
Yeah, interesting. So like when you're so you obviously moved to Yale from you're an associate prof at NYU, and then
I was a postdoc at NYU.
Okay, you're a postdoc at NYU. So what prompted you to go to Yale from there? I mean, maybe there's just no. I know the prof stuff.
There were. I got both the postdoc offer and the Yale offer as part of the same, run at the job market, right? So I deferred starting the Yale position to do the postdoc.
Okay, interesting.
It wasn't like I did the postdoc and then left, and then from there applied and got the Yale position.
Interesting, but what's the like? Let's say I guess there are advantages to be at NYU versus Yale, and there are advantages to being at Yale versus NYU. Obviously, location matters. Especially if you're from New York, and also, there's kind of like a reputation thing. Like she's like, presumably, if your mother says like, "Oh, my son Dan, he's at Yale," everyone's more impressed than NYU, stuff like that. Like, but how do philosophy profs think of that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I doubt it's any different from how anybody else does. Yeah, I think you're right about the various factors that are going to get traded off. Money, location. Then, I mean, when you say reputation, there is this distinction between within field reputation and kind of just in the general public reputation.
Yeah.
And how does that matter? Well, I mean, like probably the at a university that has a better overall reputation, you're going to have stronger undergraduate students. at a university that's better, specifically for philosophy, then you'll probably have better graduate students, because graduate students are probably focusing more on the field specific reputation than on the overall. Though I think you kind of, it's hard to have that kind of divergence between field specific reputation and overall reputation if you don't have something like the rankings that are trusted as carrying some weight. Because if you don't have that, then people just kind of default to overall reputations and deciding what schools are impressive. So my hypothesis would be, if you look at fields that don't have that, then it would be more rare for a graduate student to say, turn down Yale for NYU. Find me some other field where Yale and NYU both have programs. Yeah. Certainly, we lose graduate students to NYU in philosophy. I suspect that happens more rarely in English or
yeah.
But I don't know if English has these rankings, and also Yale has a great English department. So, but I feel like there's a hypothesis I could make precise and testable, and I think find a bunch of fields that don't have these rankings, and my guess is that then when you look at head-to-head choices that grad students are making, they're usually going to go to the one that's higher on the U.S. News one, even though that's not field specific.
And do you care more about undergrads? Like, do you work, like as a prof, do you work more, do you spend most of your time with graduate students or with undergrads, and like how does that work?
It's both. I can both say for me specifically, but also generally. It's going to vary from school to school, right? So how much teaching you have and what the distribution is between undergrad and graduate teaching, right? Like plenty of schools don't have graduate programs, so that it's all undergrad. At a school like Yale, I'd say it's, and even within Yale, it's probably going to vary from person to person. I mean, it's not going to vary that much how much teaching they're doing, but certainly how many graduate students you have, that may just depend. Some faculty attract a lot of graduate students, some don't, because of what they work on. Or there's momentum, right? Like somebody who has a history of lots of students that have gone on to do well. Students that are coming in will want to work with them. And for me personally, I feel like they're different kinds of activity. I like the kind of one-on-one, deeper conversations that you can have with grad students about their work. But I also very much like, kind of introducing people to the kind of questions in the field. So like I pretty regularly teach first year intro class, and I don't think I'd want to only do one.
Interesting. So it's such a different world from my world, from startup space.
I suspect the biggest, to me, what feels like the biggest difference is the amount of uncertainty and risk that's involved.
Yeah.
Like I suspect, just knowing my views about things, I suspect I'm just generally more like, I have lots of respect for like the startup world, the entrepreneurial world, and I feel like it's very much not for me because I just don't think I have the risk tolerance that I suspect you need to have.
Well, it's risk. I think especially if you work in venture, like in this type of stuff I do, right, where you have venture capital, like the actual risk you're taking personally is not that huge. Worst case is a job, right? A lower paid job, but honestly, the difference between making like 100K and 300K or whatever is not, that huge. And I think the biggest thing is just the amount of stress.
Yeah.
Like it's just a lot of stress when you're an entrepreneur. Like you have a lot. Well, it's like you have a lot of responsibility, and when things go wrong, they're your problem, and that's very stressful. And then necessarily you let people down, right? And like when you're responsible for a lot of things, and a lot of things can go wrong, like you let people down, and that's very like hard as a human to do.
Yeah. And I feel at least post tenure, we just don't have anything. Maybe if you're in graduate placement, right? So it's sort of on you to try and make sure that our grad students get jobs. I've never had that role, and it sounds like a very stressful role for exactly the reason that you just mentioned. But yeah, I think by and large, there's just a lot less uncertainty about what the broad contours of your life are going to look like over the next 5-10 years. And that suits me just fine. But yeah, I think if I were sort of braver, more courageous, then I could better imagine enjoying the entrepreneurial world.
So, okay, let's dive into this topic. So what we want to discuss is essentially decision making, which is, how do you do to know what is the right thing to do? And we can take my specific situation where I'm starting a new business, right? Or I'm doing research on what this new business should be. And, it's like, well, is this a good business to start? And, you can definitely know, like once you're Mark Zuckerberg, you're definitely 100% sure that your business is going to be successful, or that it has been successful. But if you're Mark Zuckerberg on day 0 of Facebook, you don't know that. And there's no way to be 100% sure, but you want to kind of like manage the risk and kind of like know whatever is knowable so that you can take intelligent risk. And there's this kind of the concept or framework that you had used, which was, or an example you used, which is like, how would you make decisions in a context where a lot of things are actually knowable? And you talked to me about a kind of like poker example, which I really liked, even though neither you nor I really play poker. But can you can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like what like how does a poker example illustrate it's kind of idealized world where you can know things?
Yeah. So we were talking about decision making, and we were saying that the kind of ideal for when you'd really like to know what the right thing to do is, right? Not know that that it'll turn out well, but know that you're making the best use of the information you've got. I think poker is a nice, or other games of chance, blackjack, right? It's a nice illustration of this because you know exactly what the relevant possibilities are, right? The relevant possibilities are what cards is your opponent holding, what cards are going to be turned over. If we're doing Texas Hold'em, what are the community cards going to be? What do your opponents have? And it's also easy to assign values to each of these. Like how good would it be if you win the pot? Well, we know exactly how good it would be because we know how big the pot is. And real life cases are always much thornier because there's no way that you can list all, like for a decision like the one you're talking about. Should I start this business? It's much harder to decide what the relevant distinctions in ways the world might be are, right? In poker, it's like I said, just what cards are about to be dealt, and what cards do your opponents already have. There are other distinctions, right? What did the dealer have for lunch? But you can just totally ignore that. That doesn't matter at all. In whether I should start a business, there's a kind of just open-ended set of distinctions that you might pay attention to, and no obvious way, at least no obvious general rule for deciding here are the distinctions I should be thinking about. If I'm setting up a little decision theoretic model, I should have a world where things are this way and a world where things are that way. Like I have a world where my opponent has these cards and a world where my opponent has those cards. It's harder to decide what those should be, and it's more of like I think more art than science. This is closely related to a problem in AI that gets called the frame problem, which I really like how Daniel Dennett illustrates it. He imagines trying to build an intelligent robot. And your first version of the robot, like it had to go into a room and get its battery out of the room, and it pulls a wagon. Its battery's on a wagon, so it pulls the wagon out of the room. Great. Turns out there was also a bomb on the wagon, so its battery blows up. So the engineers go back to the drawing board and they say, we need to have it, deduce the consequences of its actions. And the second version of the robot, it's sitting outside the room, deducing that if it pulls the wagon out, then the color, the paint on the walls won't change color. And it's also deducing that if it pulls the wagon out, the wheels will make more rotations than the number of seconds that it takes to pull the wagon out. It's just like all these, irrelevant things. And, it blows up because in the time it takes to do all that deducing, like it was a time bomb, right? There's only so much time. So yeah, the challenge is being such that somehow the possibilities that strike you as the important ones, right? The distinctions that strike you as the important ones to pay attention to are ones that are sort of tractable enough that you can actually get a grip on them, right? It's not everything, but also sort of informative enough that thinking about those really does help you figure out what to do. But that's not to tell you how to do it. That's just a kind of description of why it's so much harder to make real world decisions than to play poker.
So there's this framework that Reid uses, Reid Hoffman, to make decisions. And his framework, essentially what he does, it makes like, I've adapted it. It's kind of the same thing, but it's just adapted for math nerds. And what it is what I do is I create a decision-making algorithm. So I'll kind of like create a spreadsheet and I'll say like, hey, here's something like, why are you making this decision? Or why is this the right decision? And what are the criteria? Like what is like explicitly state what it is that, the drivers, the criteria, the data that's driving that decision. And it's amazing how difficult it is to actually do that, right? Because a lot of the decision making you make is implicit. So an example of how I'm using that right now. So I'm exploring a potential business idea, and I'm trying to figure out like what are the best segments or customer segments to be focused on. And then I chose 3 segments that seemed to be right for us. And then we created an algorithm for each segment. Like why would each of these segments be good versus not? And then when we go out to collect information, we'll come across things, be like, actually, here's some new information that I hadn't considered in my decision making, and let me, add complexity to my algorithm, my decision making algorithm. So I want to see from you, like how does that framework kind of land with you from your kind of like philosopher perspective, and what would you improve? How would you kind of like explain it and rationalize it?
Yeah, I want to hear more about it, right? So we say you've got a spreadsheet where it's supposed to list all the factors that are figuring into your decision. But then what do you do with the list? I mean, like, because you could think like a pro and con list, right? Here, and count up pros versus cons. But I just kind of want to know what do you do when you've got all when you've got this list?
Yeah. So what we do, we'll say, okay, well, what we want is, so we're looking for the general idea. It's like a content creator monetization tool, essentially. And then it's like, okay, well, here, like the two obvious factors are this person has a lot of people that can pay the money.
Mhm.
And then this person is really desperate to make money, right? So let's say I'm not desperate to make money. I do this podcast. I'm not paid. I couldn't care less. Even if I made like 5K a month making this, I wouldn't care. While there are some content creators, if they made 5K a month, they'd be really happy to make 5K a month, right? So there's a kind of component of like they really want to make money and they have no other way to make money. And then they have a lot of viewers, a big audience that would pay them money, right? So that's kind of, the original thing. And then what I'll do is I'll find, criteria. So it's like, well, what is the criteria? Well, okay, well, I'll go look at the real world criteria for that. So it's like, well, one criteria is, do they have a way of making money outside of their content creation? So that's the case for me. So I'll kind of like create a calculation or kind of an algorithm for like what would make somebody desperate to make money. They have no other way to make money outside of content creation. There's no obvious way for them to make money through the content creation, stuff like that. And so I'll kind of, as I think things through, essentially formalize my implicit decision-making or make my implicit decision-making explicit. And then, I'll say, well, and then I'll put scores. So I'm like, score of 1 if they have 0 way of making money in anything. And then, the score would go down to 0. And then like, if they have a total score of above, across all the criteria, they have a total score of 3 or above, that means, yes, they'd be perfect. Something like that. And then I'll come to my conclusion. Yeah, it seems like they're good. And then I'll go out into the world and try to collect additional data. And let's say a data point I might come across is, well, this person, they have a really inflated sense of how much money they should make. Like entrepreneurs have a really inflated, like essentially like successful entrepreneurs and successful venture capital investors really think they should make a lot more money than almost anybody else in the world. Sorry,
that's there's an ambiguity, and I'm curious which one you meant. Do you mean they think that they should make more money than other people make, or they think they should make more money than other people think of themselves? Like, is it they're having the comparative thought, or they're thinking, right, here's how much I deserve, and whereas everybody else is thinking, here's how much I deserve, and it's a lower number?
Correct. Well, I think
it could be both.
That's the question. It's like unclear, right? So it's like, so like what you want is a kind of match between those two things. And, how do you do to evaluate that? Well, I think one of the factors that are knowable for me at this stage is how much money, like what their hourly rate is in their mind.
Yeah.
Right. So like my hourly rate in my mind is $10,000 an hour. Right. And I legitimately charge people that to do work. And like, that's how much I think I am worth. And if you're going to try to help me make money, like, let's say if you're helping me make like 5K an hour and you're doing the lead gen for me, I'll do it. If it's like $100 an hour, like forget it. While presumably a grad student, $100 an hour, they'd be really happy to make that. So it's just like that then becomes an additional criteria that I kind of add into my algorithm, and I might end up saying like, actually, turns out this is a bad person. But there's this like this tension between the fact that I don't know what the criteria is, or like I can't sit down and explain to you what the criteria is, but when I come across things, I know that it's right, or I know that it's wrong, right? And then I try to make explicit what I kind of implicitly know. So I'm like, hey, these guys, they just want too much money. And it's like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, why does it matter, right? And as you say, it's like, Is it the match between how much people want to pay them versus how much they want to be paid? Is it just the total amount? Like, you just don't want people to be charging that much money. And like, why would it be one versus the other? And it's actually a super complex set of criteria. And at some point, so for this decision of like identifying the ideal customer segment, I will get to an algorithm that's broadly applicable across all segments. And it might have like 50 criteria, but it's broadly applicable across all segments. So then I can use it to pick my first segment. And once I've saturated that segment, then I can use it to pick my second segment. And I might make some small adjustments, but it then becomes a useful tool for decision making.
So if you list all these factors and you assign them scores, do you ever find that the ranking that comes from doing that, conflicts with what you would have thought without using the method? And then when you find that, does that make you think, do you trust the algorithm, or instead say, I wonder if I underweighted something that now I'm like realizing is actually really important?
Correct. That's it. Like, I kind of trust my own judgment to make the decision, right? So it's like, if the algorithm tells me to go one way and I'm like, yeah, that's just wrong, I trust my own judgment.
Yeah.
And then I use this investment thesis essentially to make explicit why that is, or why it is that I like. So it's kind of like taking my implicit judgment. And I found as a human, I'm pretty good at making a judgment, but then it's like, there's so many factors involved in that, and processing all that and thinking it through. I just like, for some reason, I don't think anyone can really.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sympathetic to, in the case like where you're describing, to trust in your judgment more than trust in this method you've described, because I just wouldn't trust whatever I'd come up with as a way of combining all these factors to come up with an overall verdict. You're kind of making like, if the way you do it is you assign scores to each of the factors and then add them up, that's a really substantive assumption about how they interact, right? That they're kind of additive and independent. And to try and do the algorithm without that assumption, you'd have a lot more factors, right? Because for each of the, like, if this is a plus, then that's a plus. Then if we want to allow for the possibility that the way they matter is not just a kind of linear additive way, then we need another factor that says, do you have both of these, right? And that can have a value, independent of the values for those two things. And if you put in all those, now it just quickly gets like intractably large. And so, yeah, my sense is that I just wouldn't, whatever I would come up with, I probably would do, like, if I had to make all this explicit, I'd probably have to make that kind of additivity assumption. But then if that conflicts with my intuitive judgments, I'm going to say, well, that probably just tells you that I was either assigning the wrong weights or combining them in an overly simple way. And then that makes me wonder, was I really, like, am I improving my judgment by doing all this? Or if I'm always just going to trust my judgment over the output of the algorithm when they conflict, then what's the algorithm doing for me?
Yeah, and I think at least in the way I think about it, and this is kind of an idea I stole from Reed. He does it differently. He does it essentially with like a memo, like an investment thesis, because he's an investor. But I think the idea is to break down this complex decision into like a series of smaller decisions.
Yeah. And
then to separate out the decision from the data. So it's like possible, I think you kind of allude to this, like it's possible to make the right decision and have the wrong outcome because, whatever the available data you had at the time was wrong.
Yeah.
And then
poker was the example we used last time where that's really clear, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, so it's kind of like, hey, here's my decision, right? And this is how I made the decision. and it's this multifaceted set of decisions, right? And so let's say it's like, well, one of the reasons, actually, let's say in the example I was using of entrepreneurs who want to be paid a lot of money per hour. I'm like, so one of the reasons I think entrepreneurs are a great segment for us is that they want to be paid a lot per hour, and that gives us like a higher take rate or more money because they're transacting on our platform. So that's kind of my belief, and that's my decision. And then later I might discover, oh, actually, I want to be paid a lot because I'm really obnoxious. But it turns out all the other entrepreneurs, they're actually fine with making $30 an hour. And that's just how they are. So my decision was the right decision, or the right criteria used to make the decision, but it happens that the data I had, which is my own experience, let's say, was wrong. And now that I have this new data about what the real world is like through execution, I can revisit my decision and say, hey, this was the right decision, or the right decision-making structure, but it was a wrong outcome because I had the wrong data, and I can now make a different decision and quickly adjust course. I think that's kind of how it's useful.
Yeah. That all sounds plausible to me. I guess I could easily imagine that even if I would always trust my intuition over the output, it could still be that in the course of making all this explicit, I'm changing my judgments, and so I even if I'm ultimately going to rely on something that I can't really make fully explicit, the process of having to write all these factors down might in forcing me to think about how important they are, might lead to my having an intuitive judgment that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone through the process.
Well, so I'm interested in your perspective on like why it is that your intuition, or my intuition, is superior to some type of more structured approach.
I mean, I think this relates to stuff we were talking about a while earlier. The AI, rationalism versus empiricism. Right? Like, if you think, then this is a huge if, but if you think something broadly like, connectionist deep learning style is like something like how a lot of our intuitive judgments are formed, then it shouldn't be surprising if we can't explicitly articulate pretty easily understandable general rules that vindicate them, because it's no notorious thing that even though we know exactly what the basic principles, the basic building blocks of deep learning, neural networks are, we still we can't explain them, right? We talk about explainable AI. We don't really can't understand in any particular instance why deep learning algorithm spat out the answer that it did. And our brains, I think, are a lot more opaque to us than those already not explainable deep learning algorithms. But but we have good reason to trust them on a lot of stuff because they've gotten us through many generations of evolution, and if you're alive, then many years of your particular brain getting you through this planet. So so the fact that we can't explicitly articulate reasons behind a judgment, I don't think that should make us skeptical that we're picking up on things that matter any more than the fact that some machine learning algorithm trained on a lot of data, selected for accuracy, spits out an answer where we can't explain that answer in terms of plausible general principles.
So how would you think of the fact that making your thought process, or kind of like making the case or explaining your decision, so you have this kind of like implicit decision making, and then explaining it in detail reveals or like helps you process it in a better way. And so maybe something that would be more familiar to you is, you're thinking about a topic, and then you have to write a paper about it, and it's like a 20-page paper. And in the process of writing that paper, you're forced to make your opinions or your beliefs or what you're arguing explicit by writing it down. And presumably that helps you think about it more clearly and have a more grounded opinion, or a more accurate opinion, or more useful at least. And that's, at least that's what I found with like when I write. Like, how would you think of, like, why is it that you're somehow discovering new knowable information or insight maybe by making explicit what you are thinking?
Yeah, good question. I'm trying to decide how similar or different I think is the just refining your thinking about a topic by having to write a paper on it versus you've got some discrete decision and you're trying to make a better decision by explicitly listing relevant factors and assigning weights to them. Because I find myself sort of more confident that I'm going to trust my thinking on a topic after I force myself to try and write a paper on it. But that may be because what I'm imagining is a case where I don't even feel like I've got sort of a set of discrete options, right? Like start in this segment or start in that segment. It's more like I've got to start writing to know what I think, or at least a lot of the initial writing just is even like trying to figure out what the relevant questions are. Maybe testing out some ways of dividing up the space and seeing they don't work too well. Whereas maybe in the kind of business context you were talking about, I was imagining you already had a bit of a better sense of the structure of the problem. We're just like trying to come up with a ranking of options where you already kind of knew those were the options.
Yeah, not really. Like actually, like in my experience at least, like it's kind of the same thing. So let's say if I like sit down earlier today, I was writing a LinkedIn post. I post on LinkedIn twice a day. And I was writing a LinkedIn post that I scheduled for like in a month. And what I was trying to do was to explain, like I have this feeling that hating Donald Trump is like, let's say 6 months ago is definitely a kind of like on trend, like totally culturally appropriate thing to do. While today it just feels less culturally appropriate to kind of like vehemently hate him. And like it just feels like it's headed in that direction. I was like, oh, like I have this like feeling about this. And I wrote up this essentially blog post, right, about it. And that process of writing that out created tremendous clarity in my mind about, all the factors and like why I feel that way and why I might be wrong, stuff like that. And that's actually pretty much the exact same thing that happens when I write an investment thesis. It's like I am making this decision, or let's say I'm deciding to go with this segment, and here's why I think this is the right segment. Like when I go into it, I have this like inkling of a sense that it's that. And then I might end up at the end realizing, actually, this is total bullshit. Like, this is not the right segment at all. Or, hey, actually, hating Donald Trump is still super popular. And I just like, and there's like something that gets revealed. There's like from going from like the murkiness of your thoughts to kind of like an explicit outline of an argument. I don't know. What's been your experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you're saying resonates with me. Yeah, I feel like it is a process of, and now I'm just trying to render consistent these like two judgments I have. On the one hand, that this general thing about thinking, you shouldn't expect most of your intuitive judgments to have an explicit articulation given plausible assumptions about how how your brain works. And on the other hand, that in some hard to delineate class of cases, the process of trying to come up with explicit defenses of something really feels like either it can, when you find that you can think, okay, yeah, I'm more confident in what I initially thought about the topic because I realized there's, I tried to rationalize it and I was able to come up with something that sounded pretty good. Versus if I try to think about it, maybe try to rationalize what I initially thought, and then find that nothing I'm coming up with sounds all that appealing, that I back off. And maybe that's not described that way. Maybe that's, you can think of that as a plausible kind of Bayesian sort of process, right? And that, well, if I'm right about this, then a kind of moderate search for good arguments, search of the space of arguments for good arguments should turn up some pretty good stuff. Whereas if I'm wrong, then a search of the space of good arguments or space of arguments should turn up only arguments that look not that good to me. And I guess as long as I think I'm better at sort of checking arguments for how persuasive they are than at kind of immediately jumping to the best one, then that's a kind of reason why I might trust this process. And then for general background reasons, you might think there are lots of things where it's easier for us to check a potential answer than it is for us to generate plausible potential answers.
Yes, it's kind of like,
I should say I've got to go pretty soon. I've got a class.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we can wrap this up. I just want to try to summarize what I understood from what you're saying. It's kind of like, if I could create a rule-based algorithm that gets me to an outcome, and I can also get to that outcome by using, let's say, a machine learning algorithm, there's a higher likelihood that it's, the right outcome. Yeah, I think that sounds, useful to me. And Dan, I don't want to make your students late, or make you late for your students. So we'll, wrap this up. And thank you for making time for us, and thank you for everybody who sat in on this. And again, folks, you can find Dan just by Googling him or looking up his book. And Dan, what's the name of your book again? Idealization in Epistemology.
Okay, thanks. This was great.
Well, thank you. And I'm ending the stream.